Thank you very much, Denise and St. Louis County Library for hosting tonight. I'm thrilled to be here with you all. And if we could hit the lights, perhaps. Great. Make this a little bit spookier. Thank you. So as Denise mentioned, tonight I'm going to be talking about anthropology of the supernatural, what exactly this is, some of the basics of the discipline, looking at the cultural evolution of Halloween and its associated mythology. So when you think of anthropology, what comes to mind? What's the stereotype that comes to mind? Anyone?
Tribal cultures.
Okay, tribal cultures. A lot of people have stereotypical imagery such as tribal spears, skulls, that comes to mind. Anthropology is the study of humanity. And if that sounds really broad, it's because it is. We look at holistically at all different cultures, not just tribes, not just bands of people, but any culture. So you can conduct anthropology right in your own backyard here in St. Louis. There are 4 subfields within anthropology: cultural anthropology, also called sociocultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and biological or physical anthropology. And perhaps the most famous of the subfields is archaeology. So a lot of people have the idea that that's all the anthropology is about. And archaeology is the material culture aspect of the discipline. So we do have the 4 subfields. Now today we're focused on cultural anthropology, okay, as our main subfield that we're talking about. In anthropology, we want to use a culturally relativistic lens. And what that means is that we want to take cultures based upon their own context. We want to avoid bias in our study, so we want to avoid ethnocentrism, which is the opposite of cultural relativism. And traditionally, the discipline of anthropology was very ethnocentric. It was Eurocentric. The early anthropologists believed that Europe was the pinnacle of civilization, and they used ethnocentric terms like savage and barbaric and primitive to describe non-European cultures. So there's been a whole evolution of the discipline of anthropology, becoming much more open, valuing the native or the believer perspective called the emic viewpoint. We'll talk about that in just a moment. This is an image of Dr. Wade Davis. And Dr. Davis is known for his study of Haitian voodoo and zombification. And so what he found was that a neurotoxin was used, and it was made into a powdery substance that was blown into an individual's face, producing a zombie-like state. And the person didn't actually die and come back to life, but they were in a state where their bodily functions were barely perceptible, so that others believed that they had returned from the dead. So in the zombie-like state, they were working as laborers in the fields. It was a social leveling mechanism to control these individuals. So his work was made into, he wrote a book, Serpent and the Rainbow. It was popularized in a fictitious horror film in the late 1980s, The Serpent and the Rainbow. Highly critical scholars are of that film because it really emphasizes the negative aspects of the religion of Voodoo. So popular culture and the study of anthropology is really significant in evaluating these films, evaluating these novels, and looking at the true cultural origins and how stereotypes are often perpetuated and why they persist. So there's a lot of interest in Voodoo. There's a lot of interest in other syncretic religions that combine magical rituals with offerings, but they are valid religions. They are religions, they are belief systems, but they're often poorly misunderstood by outsiders, and part of that is due to the popularity of horror films. So other operant definitions that we're looking at tonight, when I'm talking about the supernatural, the definition that we're using is what is beyond the scientific method or beyond the laws of nature. Now, from an emic viewpoint, which means native or believer view, sometimes that term supernatural is rejected. They believe that this is just part of their natural world. So, for example, in a culture that believes that threats from spirits are very real and an everyday occurrence, and that you have to protect yourself ritualistically from those spirits. It's not just a once in a while occurrence. These attacks could come at any time. So there are these distinctions between emic and etic viewpoints. Myth, when we're talking about myth, a lot of people, what comes to mind when I say myth?
Greek.
Okay, Greek, okay. Or what else? Maybe falsehoods, does that come to mind? So in anthropology, we're talking about sacred narratives. That's our definition that we're working with. Etic is the outsider or the anthropological viewpoint, and I'll be using these terms again shortly. Syncretism, a blending of cultural traditions. So for example, the religion of Vodun, popularly known as Voodoo, is a syncretic religion that combines African tribal traditions with that of Christianity and sometimes Native American traditions. Archetype, a proto-idea of the collective or symbolic imagery. Ritual means repetitive stereotyped act. And rituals are not just religious, they can also be secular. Magic means attempt to influence an outcome. So when we're talking about magic today, we're not talking about stage magic like David Copperfield or Chris Angel or Houdini. We are talking about ritual magic. All right, well, I want to start off talking about the origins of Halloween. And how many of you have read or studied the cultural evolution of Halloween? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, so quite a few of you have. And so today we think of Halloween, do we think of Halloween mostly as religious or secular? Secular, right. So originally, 2,000 years ago, the Celtic people living in Ireland, living in Scotland, living in the Isle of Man, were practicing something called Samhain. Now, it looks like it would be pronounced Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. And during the time of Samhain, the October 31st was the eve of November 1st, which was the New Year. And this was when the harvest was ending and it was the beginning of winter. And during this time, the ancient Celtic people believed that the veil between worlds thinned. And at this time, spirits could be wandering. And sometimes those spirits were to be feared, sometimes they were to be revered and honored. So there's an ancestor worship taking place. Now, ritualistically speaking, a lot of interesting things were happening at this time that have persisted through today and 2018. For example, there would be bonfires that would be lit. And these bonfires would draw insects, they would draw bats. So you have some imagery that has persisted that's still connected with Halloween. During this time, the Druids, the leaders within the Celtic society would be reading animal entrails as a divination ritual. And divination was really important in this pre-scientific time to foretell coming events about the next year. So it was a way to bring certainty to the group. This is a liminal period from an Etic perspective in anthropology. We use the term liminal, meaning that it doesn't occur all of the time. This is a temporary, ritualized time of year. And animals, cattle, for example, were being slaughtered. This was primarily a pastoralist situation. Feasting was taking place. And also, members were going door to door in disguises. So as a way to either blend in with spirits or to protect themselves from spirits. The symbolism of the fire could be interpreted as purification. How many of you like to go to bonfires, for example? Okay, great. And so in many cultures, fire is about purification. You release, you burn something, you're letting go. And so one interpretation is that a bonfire reflects the sun, and the sun is very powerful. This would be a sympathetic magical ritual from an Edic perspective because it's akin to the sun. There's a lot that we don't know. There are various interpretations. We need to make sure that we point that out. Interesting things happen when the Romans invade this territory. They bring their festivals with them. For example, they have the festival of Pomona, which was the goddess of fruits and nuts, symbolized by the apple. Eventually, the Romans convert to Christianity. And with that, the holiday becomes syncretic, meaning, again, that cultural blending. So you have holidays instituted, All Saints' Day, November 1st, it's moved to November 1st, All Souls' Day, November 2nd. And what happens is that the Christian groups try to take away the pagan aspects that have existed for a very long time. But they're not dying off, so they have to reverse their strategy. So what they end up doing is, instead of burning the groves, for example, where the Celts are practicing, they don't build churches, they practice in open tree groves. They say, well, we're not going to burn this down, we're going to consecrate this in the name of Christ. So it was a way to try to slowly convert the masses. But what ends up happening is these traditions are blended. By the time that immigrants start coming, we're going to speed up a little bit here, to the U.S., they're changing ritual activity. So for example, traditionally the Celts would have carved, or later people would have carved turnips in Ireland, for example. This is an example in a museum in Ireland. But now when the immigrants come to America, they're carving what? Pumpkins. Much easier to carve, right, than a turnip. Have any of you tried to carve a turnip before? No, okay. So these parties came about in colonial America. Irish immigrants, especially later on, would really bring their traditions with them. In the colonies, the Puritans were not in favor of these pagan and too Catholic rituals and traditions. But in the southern colonies, like Virginia, they were having gatherings, communal rituals, divination rituals were taking place. For example, in a patriarchal society that's male dominant, female status relies on what? Finding, right, a husband. Okay, so a lot of the divination rituals are focused on who will my husband be, okay, and giving them some sense of certainty about their future. Apple bobbing that's depicted in this painting is also a carryover, again, from Goddess of Pomona. So we see a lot of carryover through the evolution of Halloween. Later on, Halloween becomes secular, mostly as we know it today. It goes through a period of transformation throughout the 20th century where it's more child-centric for a period of time instead of focused on the adults. But now, in 2018, do adults like to get involved as well? Yeah. And so the latest statistic that I saw this week, the estimate for 2018 is that $9 billion will be spent on Halloween this year. $9 billion. So from a psychosocial perspective, the importance of Halloween today is that people need Halloween. Okay, that's one interpretation, that people, it's a way to release. It's a way to dress up as someone else, to try out another identity. It's fun. We don't want to ignore the entertainment part, but not everybody participates. Okay, so there's various reasons for that. All right, now one of the themes associated with Halloween is witchcraft. And a lot of you have studied at some point the Salem witch trials. Let me see a show of hands. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about Salem today. I am going to talk about witchcraft briefly in Quaker communities. So in William Penn's colony, there was one witchcraft trial. How many of you have heard of this before? All right, it's kind of a little bit of forgotten history unless you're really into the study of witchcraft. What happened is the trial of Margaret Matson in 1683 to 1684. Margaret Matson was a Swedish immigrant, and she was accused of bewitching cattle. And what happened, William Penn presided over this case, and ironically, I've always had an interest in the study of witchcraft, and when I was researching this, I found out that my 9th great-grandfather was the translator in this case. Believe it or not. His name was James Claypool, and he was one of the founders of Philadelphia. So he spoke multiple languages, but what I found interesting about this was that the Quakers were more lenient than the Puritans. And they found her guilty of witchy ways, but not guilty of bewitching the cattle. So she was heavily fined, but she was not physically harmed. Okay, she was not executed. So that's a case, again, 1683 to 1684, Margaret Matson and the Quakers. Okay, now talking about magical thinking and attempting to influence an outcome. This often occurs in an altered state of consciousness. So when we're talking about these topics today, and I want to mention this talk is geared for high school and adult audience, so I will be talking about things like possession briefly, demons briefly, but we won't be participating in any rituals or invocations today. So that's a common misperception about anthropology, that, you know, if you take an anthropology of religion, magic, and science class, that you're going to be, you know, drawing a symbol on the floor and lighting candles, but that's not what's going on. So we're studying it from an academic perspective. Now, what's important to note when we're talking about these subjects, anthropologists do not need to know if it's true. Somebody believes it to be true, that makes it worthy of study. Okay, so that's a really important distinction. So you have anthropologists from all different backgrounds, all different belief systems, using that culturally relativistic lens. And they do use the scientific method, heavily focused not just on quantitative data, but qualitative data. So ethnographies are conducted where you're studying a particular culture, a particular group of people. You might actually be participating in the rituals with them, which is called participant observation. So when you're studying these sorts of things, when you're studying witchcraft, when you're studying magical rituals, you want to do what with the people that you're studying, do you think? How do you want to engage with them? How do you want to act toward them?
I mean, as if you're respecting what they're doing, not as a very doubtful person.
Yes, being respectful. That doesn't mean you have to believe what you're studying, but being respectful, being open, and establishing rapport, right? So you want to have that trust relationship so that they're honest with you about their rituals, about their beliefs, and that you're properly documenting that with your methodology. Okay, so going into these topics, the altered state of consciousness is a different way of thinking. It's going into another state of consciousness. Mental experiences that transcend ordinary experiences. And often this means a liminal state. You're in between, it's temporary, and this definition is subjective and includes a wide variety of phenomena. So we're talking about altered states. What comes to mind? Drugs. And drugs are one gateway to an altered state, but also music, rhythmic drumming, dancing, Right, meditation, excellent. Fasting, prayer, yes, excellent. So these are all forms of altered states. Now, talking about supernatural and popular culture, have any of you watched the early 1980s film Altered States? Okay, a couple of you have. The horror film. So again, horror films have really popularized these themes. And, you know, if we study those themes, if we start with what people are familiar with, right, and then we delve into what are the real origins here, or how is this misportraying this culture? What are the stereotypes? What are the themes? So that's what we're talking about here with these courses. So again, sacred pain, many cultures might use cutting, for example, as a form of ritualized activity to invoke an altered state of consciousness, biological basis, fasting, drug-induced states. Okay, so what's legal drugs here might not be legal elsewhere and vice versa. So, you know, we're looking at a lot of cultures that use hallucinogenics or hallucinogenic snuff, and that would be part of their invocation to an altered state of consciousness. Now, one example of an altered state of consciousness would be spirit possession, okay, or the idea of possession. And a lot of people wrongly believe that this only happens in Catholicism, okay, or Christianity in general. But we see this in many different belief systems, this idea of possession and exorcism. And there are common themes from culture to culture. There are also variations. And so this idea that the cure or the healer, okay, the religious practitioner or leader, needs to demonstrate power is a common theme. So whether it's a priest or a shaman or a cure, they need to demonstrate the ability to the community that they have the power to treat that patient, the one that is possessed. So again, there's cultural variation here, but I want you to know it's not just Catholicism, for example. So what is possession? We use the definition of controlled or dominated by spirits. Or in some cultures, the soul has left the body. This belief in soul or spirit that it's wandering and it needs to be put back in. Exorcism, defined as expulsion of an evil spirit from person or place. Cure, a healer, usually a part-time specialist. And a spirit being defined as supernatural being with less power than a deity. Now, evolution of the demon. When I say demon, do you think of positive, negative, or somewhat in between connotation to that term? Negative, okay? So Christian religions, other religions would view this demon concept as mostly negative or all negative. Before that, the concept of the term, the daemon, is in Latin and Greek as meaning godlike power, fate, or God. Okay, so in Greek cultures, for example, it was viewed as more of the voice of the intuition, okay? That it didn't have a negative connotation, but if someone was in danger, the daemon voice might speak to them, might bring them some sort of enlightenment or warning about the future. So there's been this evolution of this term that's important to note. Spirits are eventually categorized into good and evil. Okay, so you have this hierarchy, you have this categorization using a dualistic lens of looking at the world, binary thinking, good and evil. So the demon within Christianity, for example, and other religions is often referred to as a malevolent being, okay, that can cause harm, an unclean spirit, a fallen angel that can be conjured and controlled. So there's this hierarchy, there's this categorization of these entities that must be dealt with ritualistically. Okay, so you have these different images of the succubus and the incubus, okay? And in many cultures, it's referred to as something like an old hag. How many of you have heard of that before? Now, from an Edic perspective, from a psychosocial perspective, we might interpret this phenomenon, okay, of an entity coming to you maybe at night and sitting on your chest, and has kind of a malevolent feeling or a heavy feeling. From a psychosocial perspective, we might describe that as a night terror, okay, or something associated with that. So a scientific explanation is offered, but many cultures still today believe that this is some type of a malevolent force, an incubus or a succubus. And again, many horror films have been created about these gendered entities that are malevolent. Paintings have been created. And so one other interpretation from an edict perspective is that women that have been harmed cross-culturally, that have experienced trauma, may have interpreted this from a psychological perspective within their belief system as a demon, okay, a demon attack. So it's really important to look holistically at these entities, at these beings, to try to understand the historical context, the cultural context at the time. All right, now other forms of altered state of consciousness. Here we have a photo of the Yanomami tribe in Brazil and Venezuela, in the Amazon. And the Yanomami traditionally practice shamanism. Shamans are male. This is a patriarchal or male-dominant society. And when an individual dies traditionally, their body is burned on a funeral pyre, and then at some point their bones are taken, they're crushed into a powdery substance, and they're placed in a plantain soup. Now, ritualistically speaking, from an etic perspective, this is viewed as endo-cannibalism. This is within the group, and cannibalism is eating of one's own species. This is also viewed as a funerary ritual, okay? So their belief from an emic viewpoint, they believe in the Hekura spirit. That's their emic term. And they believe that it's unthinkable to bury the dead in the cold earth. They believe that to be respectful, their one's life force, their essence, their spirit, must be passed down to those closest to them. So there's a ritual where only the close family members will drink the substance. They drink their bones in the plantain soup. So when they're interviewed, it's when they talk about other cultures burying the dead in the earth, that's taboo to them traditionally. Now, you know, as outside cultures come in and encroach on their culture through forced diffusion, through willing diffusion, we may see these rituals change. But that's traditionally how they've handled the deceased, ritualistically speaking. The shamans use a hallucinogenic snuff to engage with the spirit world. So they enter an altered state of consciousness, and they have to demonstrate the ability to heal. So they use a lot of body language to indicate this power. Shamans will heal one another. We observe them laying hands on one another. There's a lot of touching to get the demon out of one, or get the sickness out of one's body and put it into something else to contain it. That is a theme that we see in many different cultures historically. This idea that spirits or demons, for example, must be ritualistically dealt with and they must be contained. So for example, within the context of Catholicism and the 1601 exorcism manual by Minghai, an Italian Renaissance exorcist, the Italian Renaissance exorcist, he talks about specific ritual exorcist treatment that contains the demon. And so it's very specific how you must contain the demon. And if you don't follow the specific formula, then that could be dangerous if you deviate from the ritual formula. So many different cultures have had ways of dealing with spirits and demons within their own context. All right, you also see a photo here within India of spirit possession. So in Hinduism, for example, there was a famous case called Taraka's ghost, and there was an individual named Sita who was possessed by her friend and relative Taraka. And in this patriarchal culture, women had received severe beatings. They were sexually assaulted, and many of these individuals were killed, and they died before their time, in horrific cases that were documented within Taraka's ghost. So if you died before your time, or if you were murdered, that made you a prime candidate to possess someone living. So in this case, Taraka died very young. She possessed her friend and cousin Sita, and she had to be ritualistically dealt with by a curer that could demonstrate the power of his exorcist ability. So that's the religion of Hinduism, again, found in many different cultures with variation. All right, now moving on to popular culture, okay? So we've talked about how stereotypes have been perpetuated by popular culture. They're also tied to Halloween. A lot of people ritualistically watch horror films, monster films during this time of year. How many of you enjoy watching horror films? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, quite a few of you. Some of you are shaking your head. No, they're not for everybody. And some people watch them year round, like myself, okay? But some people only watch them around Halloween season. Again, we even have rituals associated with secular society and holidays. So monsters are really important, and not just because they're in these entertaining films that we watch for fun. Now, the origin of the word monster derives from the Latin monstrum, meaning that which warns. The ancient Romans used the term monstra to indicate all abnormal phenomenon, or what was regarded as omens or wills of the gods. Today, the term monster means creatures that are frightening, that are oversized, there's something to reject, and they carry complex meanings with them. So from a psychosocial perspective, monsters are really significant in what they reveal about our society and what we fear. So they're complex in that they awe us, they terrorize us, they entertain us, okay? But there's something more that they reveal about who we are as a human species. So what is a monster? Well, from an academic perspective, we have social scientists like David Gilmour that have written extensively about the anthropology of the supernatural, using the phrase confining usage to the supernatural, the mythical, the magical products of imagination. Joseph Campbell talks about grotesque hybrids as monsters. So that would encompass, for example, not an all-inclusive list, but werewolves, vampires, man-eating giants, Native American creatures like Windigo, giants Gorgons, Cyclops, cryptomorphs, the Yeti, okay? Missouri's own Momo the Monster. How many of you have heard of Momo? Okay? So we have some characteristics here that we're coming up with. Now, David Gilmour, in his operant definition of monster, does not include human monsters. So serial killers, for example, would not be part of this anthropological study. Famous monsters in popular culture, Universal Studio photos here. How many of you like to watch the old 1930s and 1940s classic films? Now, these appeal to a lot of people that reject the slasher horror genre. St. Louis's own Vincent Price. How many of you are familiar with Vincent Price? Okay. He was famous for his horror films, but he made other films as well. But that's really what he's known for. Also as the voice in the Michael Jackson song Thriller is Vincent Price. And Vincent Price rejected slasher films. He was really turned off by them. He gave interviews where he's quoted saying this, but he's a St. Louis hometown person. Vincent Price. And so there are a lot of people that reject those slasher films, and they would rather watch something that's more comforting to them. And rituals in general, as repetitive stereotyped acts from a psychosocial perspective, are known for reducing anxiety. So some people like to watch horror films because they can get close to their fears, but they're not actually in danger, right? You can watch them from the safe confines of your couch. So here we have Dracula, right on the left, originally published by, who knows who published Dracula? Bram Stoker, right, 1897. In the middle, we have Frankenstein's monster. Yes, Shelley. And there on the right, we have the Wolfman. And so we could analyze each of these monsters and their symbolic meanings. What do they say about society? So when you're analyzing the anthropology of the supernatural and popular culture, it's really important to look at the historical context. How were these monsters created? Okay, what did they grow out of? One of the themes that we could talk about with Frankenstein is a fear of science, okay, a fear of change. What will we be doing if we are so-called, quote-unquote, playing God, okay? So that's one of the themes that you could analyze. The Wolfman, on the right, for example, the animalistic side of who we are, okay, what we repress, okay? So at the basic biological level, what are our needs, and if those needs are not met, what will we be capable of? So this whole idea of the monster being very close, okay, to who we are. The left-hand side with vampires, we're actually going to talk about the revenant archetype here in just a moment. But in anthropology, we would talk about gender roles, we would talk about sexuality themes, we would talk about classism, we would talk about these postmodernist approaches to these monsters. Okay, what does it say about the society in which they are produced? A revenant in anthropology is defined as one that returns from the dead. Okay, so this would encompass vampires, this would encompass zombies, and here we have an image from The Walking Dead, okay, of the walkers. And so throughout the 20th century, especially starting in the late 1960s, the zombie became very popular with George Romero's, what was the film called? Night of the Living Dead. Okay, influenced by previous works. Of course, you have Vincent Price's Last Man on Earth. Before that, it was called different names at different times. Many Romero zombie films were made, but he was influenced, for example, by Carnival of Souls from the early 1960s. Has anyone ever watched that film? Okay, so it influenced Romero. So what's important when you're looking at these myths, whether we're talking about myths in religions or we're talking about myths in popular culture, they are formulaic, they utilize archetypes, and they often use what came before. So there's often a syncretic blending, such as when we talked about Halloween, okay, being a syncretic blending of multiple cultural traditions, or we're talking about zombie films of 2018, okay? What are they building upon that existed before? So the Revenant, when we're looking at the historical context of vampires, well, in pre-scientific communities, okay, for example, in Eastern Europe, the past few hundred years, for example, someone would die, and after they died, there was a misunderstanding about the natural biological processes of decomposition. And so the body would be decaying. It might let out groans, what sound like groaning sounds, which could be frightening, right, to someone that doesn't understand the decomposition process. It also looks like the body is still growing or moving because of shrinkage. And so we would look at this in a pre-scientific viewpoint, from the pre-scientific perspective, from the emic view, that they believe that one has returned. And again, when you're talking about these monsters, they have to be ritualistically dealt with. So you might drive a stake into their body to make sure that they're not returning. Okay, so we look at the evidence, archaeologically speaking, we look at the treatment of the bodies, but we have to understand why they did this. Okay, so when we're talking about the symbolism of vampires and zombies. There's so much that we could do here. We could talk all day and night about what do vampires and zombies symbolize. There's certainly a preoccupation with what? That's a human universal here. There's a fixation of trying to understand what? Death, yeah. So that is a human universal, but cultures deal differently with it, right? There's ritualistic variation. So it's this misunderstanding, but it's also trying to deal with it in a controlled way, okay? But also zombies, there are so many different types of zombies. There's also the issue of dealing with disease. So Center for Disease Control, bringing it back to science and biomedicine, have used the zombie archetype to symbolize, right? If you know how to deal with the zombie apocalypse, you can deal with almost anything, right? So if there's an outbreak, they can actually use the zombie as kind of an entertaining way to deal with how would you prepare, right, to fight this disease and handle this. So also the idea of technology, the fear of technology. People are walking around on their cell phones in a zombie-like state. Okay, that's another interpretation. People might not be watching when they cross the street. So again, it's this way of dealing with fears, okay, and real-life threats, but from a safe distance, okay? So zombie-like state, that could relate to politics, okay? That people are not making the best choices. They're in a zombie-like, maybe they're not engaged, they have apathy. So zombies could symbolize a lot. Cannibalism taboo. We haven't really talked about this, but very briefly, that's a theme here. And so it's a taboo cross-culturally, but it is manifested in different ways. So we would also talk about that in our anthropology courses. All right, so let's talk about the Windigo briefly here. Native American culture, not all Native American cultures, but Algonquin-speaking groups, for example, in northern United States and Canada. And the Windigo has evolved in the appearance. This isn't necessarily a native artist that made this Windigo, but it's really assimilated into the masses, into popular culture and films, shows like Supernatural. How many of you have watched that show before? Supernatural, okay? I believe the X-Files may have had an episode on Windigo, but traditionally it was associated with winter and famine. And it was this idea that if you resorted to cannibalism, that was the ultimate taboo in the culture, and you were not to do that. It was better to die of starvation, okay? So it was going against the honor code, the values of the people. And if you engaged in that taboo, you were surely to become a Windigo, okay? So this monstrous creature, you were losing your humanity, okay? And so it reinforces the taboo also on greed. So in the context of colonialism, okay, Europeans coming in, invading native territories, committing ethnocide, committing genocide against the native people, this creature evolved. So you also have to understand that it was a statement within the context of colonialism, okay, about what it meant to be non-native. How do you keep your cultural identity? Okay, how do you keep your values in place? From an edict perspective, this is a monster. It is superhuman, it's shape-shifting. The appearance from Native American emic perspective differs from outsider interpretations, but there are some similar characteristics such as its size. But the claws and sometimes the horns are an addition, for example. So this creature, again, you could go Windigo. There's a Windigo psychosis that's mentioned. From an edict perspective, from a scientific perspective, we would talk about mental illness, okay, as a way to describe mental illness from an emic perspective, that one went Windigo, okay, but it might actually be, from a scientific perspective, some type of mental issue. Okay, so I I just have a couple more slides here, and then I'm going to be taking questions for the rest of the time. But the psychosocial analysis of monsters, to sum up, imaginary embodiments of terror, okay? So why are monsters so salient? Why is Halloween such a popular holiday, even if it's lost much of its religious meaning? There's a sense of mystery and a sense of evil toward humanity that intrigues people. It draws them in. Adriano, social scientist, talks about monsters as dangerous objects of fear. Okay? Again, it's something to be dealt with from a safe distance. Campbell talks about monsters as something to be cleared away. Okay? Something to be repudiated by the human spirit, who we do not want to be. Okay? That monsters can be fun, but they also have these significant meanings to them. Also looking at the symbolism of the monster and the Western view of what it means to be a monster. And that might mean being greedy, hoarding, not having empathy, not understanding your fellow human being. That might be rejecting their human rights. So monsters, even though David Gilmour's operant definition does not include humans, one could argue that the monsters are actually reflections of who we are. So monsters are not always entertaining, but they're something that must be dealt with, which is really deep. Monsters also have to be kind of this ritualistic dealing, okay? That there's a formula here. So for example, how many of you recognize this monster, okay? And so who could tell me the name of this monster? Do you know the name? Yes, it's from It. Good. Pennywise. Okay, excellent. So here we have Stephen King's Pennywise and It. And originally it came out earlier, but this is the latest interpretation this past year. And what do you know about this creature? Yeah.
He takes the form of what you fear most.
Exactly. Takes the form of what one fears the most. So it's a shapeshifter, okay? And it manifests in different ways. And it's highly intelligent psychologically speaking, okay? So that is a really significant monster because from a view of the uncanny, okay, and Freud's view, for example, the clown is powerful because it's something familiar. It's something familiar to many people. It's part of their childhood. You see a clown and it's supposed to be what? Happy, funny, right? Bringing joy, making balloons, right? It's fun. But in this uncanny theory, what is supposed to be familiar is inverted, okay? So what becomes unfamiliar, there are negative aesthetics going on here. Now it's frightening, okay? Because it's familiar, but it's not familiar. Just like a home that is not your home, it is a stranger's home, okay? That's the power of the Haunted Mansion archetype, for example, okay? Psycho, the movie, how many of you watched that before, okay? So the mansion on the hill, right? It's not your home, and there's something creepy about that, okay? You're not supposed to go in. It's a private space. So that would also be an example of the uncanny. All right, now that narrative monster approach, the monster appears from the shadows. Let's think of in the context of It and Pennywise, and is ignored, disbelieved. So somebody sees the monster, okay? And this activity has happened, but no one believes them. They are rejected. Maybe they're a person on the fringes of society that doesn't have the power and the status. Maybe in a patriarchal society, okay, that's male dominant, and someone is ignored and they're disbelieved, okay? But this monstrous act has happened. There's often a pattern of destruction followed by an awakening, an enlightenment, okay, by the community. That they say, oh, this really happened. We need to believe this person. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to control the demon? How are we going to control the monster? How are we going to make sure that this monster doesn't hurt anyone ever again? So there's a confrontation. And this is predictable to the point of ritualism, that the monster must be dealt with. There's a great rejoicing. the community is saved. Okay? So possibly then, we're talking about mythic narratives and novels and films, the monster might return at a later date. Okay? And also that helps the filmmakers make sequels, right? So we're talking about films, for example, there's an economic component too, but this cycle could be repeating itself. Okay, so we do have these formulas when we're looking at myths. Okay, now last slides here. Statistically speaking, you may be curious about supernatural beliefs in the US. Maybe you're going to a bonfire soon. Maybe you're going to a Halloween party and you can share these facts with your friends and family. From 2011 Gallup polls, a lot of the polling is older than this. 71% have had a paranormal experience, okay, in the US that are reported. 34% of respondents believe in ghosts. 41% believe in ESP. 37% believe in haunted houses. 42% believe in possession. So that's really interesting. But then you have to look at how many people don't believe. How many people have not had an experience? How many people do not believe in haunted houses, etc. But that's our data collected in case you're curious. So this is, consists of people of all different cultural backgrounds, all different belief systems that have reported. Okay, so conclusion here, we covered a lot of information tonight. We teach classes at my university at UMSL. Supernatural and Popular Culture, Zombies, Vampires, and Monsters is an online course. It's 2,000 level. We have a lot of fun with it. A lot of students are engaged, they're curious, they know something, and they want to delve deeper. Okay, so it's a fun way to learn about these anthropological topics. We also have an upper level course, 3,000 level, Anthropology of Religion, Magic, and Science. Popular culture is not the focus of that course. So we're looking at a lot of different belief systems. We're looking at rituals. We're looking at what is science, looking at different viewpoints about death, okay? And also looking at various forms of magical thinking. So we're looking at occult societies, for example, historically. We cover a lot of ground. So in these classes, concluding the supernatural and popular culture and the anthropology of the supernatural, death is a human universal. Okay, we all are born, we all will die, but how we deal with that varies from culture to culture. So they have their own rituals and beliefs. Beliefs are part of cultural systems. Okay, so culture is what is taught and what is learned. Systems that serve to answer questions about humanity, they provide a worldview structure, and they do reduce anxiety for practitioners. Traditions evolve through diffusion, cultural diffusion and adaptation, so they can change, they can evolve. U.S. society thrives on an industry of fear, consumption, and the unknown. So we are a very materialistic society. We spend a lot of money on Halloween. We have a lot of fun with it. Not everybody participates for various reasons. So it's a main economic driver as well. So these films, these novels, these computer games in a capitalist society are also serving, right, that important economic function. So all of this is part of the anthropology of the supernatural. Looking holistically at culture, what are the economics, what are the gender roles, what are the beliefs, political systems, subsistence strategies, we study all of it. Okay, so last slide here, the aliens, okay? So thinking about the myths of now and the myths of tomorrow, what will the future narratives consist of, okay? There are religions centered around aliens. There are all types of movies made about aliens. A lot of people are drawn to them. They're curious about, whether they exist. People have their different beliefs about aliens, what they may look like, okay, if they do exist. So what does that reveal about us, okay, that we've projected our myths into space, okay? So creating new myths, who knows what they will look like in 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, Okay, so that's all that I have, and I'm willing to take questions now. I've got plenty of time, 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and I thank you very much. All right. Yeah.
I'm going to be bold here.
Yeah.
There were a couple of slides that you had that didn't really get to the bottom.
Oh, okay.
And so if at some point there's time to go back to those, but I want other people to be able to ask their questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
This last one reminds me, I had a friend who's now deceased, but she grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, and
Yeah.
was in high school during the time of the UFO and the aliens. She said not a word went around the high school in that time frame. You know, high schoolers spread rumors and stuff.
Right,
She said
yeah.
Nothing. There were no rumors, there were no stories. It came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
It was placed in that location because of the military being there and everything. But she said there were never any rumors flying around or anything in high school when that was supposedly
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah,
It's interesting to look at that and sit back and say, well, where did that come from?
Yes, yeah, and that's and thank you for sharing that. The evolution of folklore, of legends. You know, we didn't really get into legends and urban legends in this talk, but certainly we do study that in anthropology as well. With technology, right? It's so now you can get online and use Twitter, and you know it goes viral. Right? So these legends, these myths have evolved. They will continue to evolve, creating new stories, new meanings associated with them. And so that's interesting, you know, in pre-internet, right, times, how these things didn't spread, why they didn't spread, as you were saying, the idea that came from elsewhere, okay, and not everybody had access.
Now, the opposite of that, when I was in high school, there were always rumors there were bodies buried in Spanish land grant park in Florida.
Okay.
Guess what? There are.
Okay, yeah, and was
They
it,
had an archaeological dig there, and
yeah.
so that was always passed around. There were bodies there. There were
Right.
probably bodies under the road, and the high school kids would, say they go out there and stuff like that. And guess what? There was an element of truth to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the unmarked graves, and were they historic burials or prehistoric?
Yeah, there are actually elements of both there.
Okay.
But if you talk to the St. Louis Archaeological Society, they'll fill you in on the dig that they did there, and they recovered things. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know all that there is out there. And that's also what piques people's curiosity, is this quest for knowledge, this curiosity about who we are, where we've been, where are we going tomorrow, okay? So there's deep meaning to these myths, and that sense of mystery about aliens or about, what's in the backyard, okay? There were Native American populations, as we know, all over the area. So, there's a lot that's not uncovered, and one could argue that should not be uncovered from one perspective when we're talking about burials, for example. And so yeah, these myths, these traditions are important for sure. Anybody else have a question before we go back to the slides? Yeah.
Have you done any field work relating to this at all?
Yeah, and so I'm a teaching professor, so I focus more on applied anthropology, so how to get students involved with volunteering or conferences or museum work. A lot of my background, I've been teaching for 12 years total. Before that, I taught and created programs at the St. Louis Science Center in ecology and environment, and I was also teaching elementary and high school educators how to excavate. So that was a really interesting experience. So a lot of my students are interested in the museum field. Working with them, I have a background in antiquarian books and manuscripts, and so attending Rare Book School, University of Virginia, focusing on how to bring in these books and these manuscripts into the classroom environment. So that's really my primary focus right now, is how do we engage in creative ways in showing students the real thing, okay, from a museological perspective is important because it's not a reproduction. It was there, and you're right there with it, okay? So you might not be able to touch it, but you have that close connection to the past. The person that made that, 10,000 years ago, you can still see their fingerprint, perhaps on the bowl, for example, the piece of pottery that's left. And so I'm a really big believer in the real thing. Okay, so giving students some type of connection to that with creative teaching methodologies. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you think supernatural shows are more popular again right now, and do you have any insight as to why that might be?
Yeah,
There's a lot out right now.
there are a lot of shows with supernatural themes, and there have been for quite some time. Supernatural, the show Supernatural has, been on for a long time. Walking Dead's been on for a long time now. Shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, go back. And so the last, 2 decades especially, we've really had a lot of supernatural themed shows. Now, like I said, this can be problematic when we talk about representation. How are these shows representing the different cultures? Is it in a respectful way? Is it an accurate way? It may be entertaining, but is it factual? Okay, is it respectful? So from an anthropological perspective, we're very concerned about that. So like I said, we will deconstruct different TV shows, we'll deconstruct video games. I had a student conducting research on tropes in archaeological video games. Okay, so Lara Croft and Tomb Raider, how are artifacts and cultures portrayed in those video games? She had a whole thesis on that. So yeah, they're popular. They'll probably continue to be popular because of those salient themes that we've talked about, how they really capture a lot of people's interest. And they say something about who we are. And people might not be conscious of that. That might be, happening on a subconscious level, but it is there and it is meaningful. Yeah.
All right, so would you find it arguable that we've made our own brand of myths by modernizing such things as the werewolf, and that it's always important to have representation after representation from anthropology point of view.
Yeah.
I feel like we've sort of made our the vampires. We've sort of made our own myth rather than drawing upon the original.
That's a really thoughtful question and observation, that the myths continue to evolve. And you're right, we do continue to make myths. We add on to them or change them, we tweak them a little bit. So the Twilight series, for example, okay? Not quite as depicted, as traditional vampires. It might be a little overlap, right? But yeah, we do grab a hold of these myths, we change them, but we have to understand why, right? Why are they being changed, and what do they reflect about 2018, for example? Okay, so we could continue to see that happen.
Argue that reflects sort of the same things about society then and now, and that's what holds them to the central theme.
Yes, there is some continuity, but there are also cultural changes as well. All right, do you have your hand raised? Yeah.
So I was trying to think of a modern day monster, like something 21st century monster, and it seems that as we've relied on science and we've learned things, there's really no new monster, and the only thing I can really think of is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering for current day, today monsters, what are they?
Yeah, I think that's thoughtful for you to mention artificial intelligence, because there's been a lot of talk about that, and it's come out in some of these series like Black Mirror. How many of you have seen the show Black Mirror? And it's very, some people have compared Black Mirror show to Twilight Zone, but it's much darker, and it's reflective of one could argue that it's our 2018 Twilight Zone, okay, because it's hard, to compare 1960s exact episodes with Black Mirror. But this idea of what is out of our control, or seemingly out of our control. How could artificial intelligence take over people's jobs, for example? So there's a lot that we could delve into with AI. It could bring about positive contributions, positive innovations for humanity. But again, it goes back to this idea of science and how we view science and deal with science. Whether we're talking about Frankenstein's monster, okay, or we're talking about people's fears about stem cell technology or gene editing, okay, or artificial intelligence. So as the technology evolves, we could argue the cultural myths evolve with them. Very thoughtful question.
And that actually goes back to the
Yeah.
last century. If you ever look at the Terminator series.
Yes. Yeah.
That was such a huge thing.
Yeah.
You see that movie and you're like, wow, this could really happen. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
Orwell type thing.
Yes. Yes. Dystopia. Right. Absolutely. You know, and also when, you know, it turned 2000, right? When we switched over from 1999 to 2000, there were a lot of fears about what would happen, and different, you know, myths emerged relating to the new year. Okay. Yeah.
Another different question. Would you comment, I'm not sure whether this is from the anthropology perspective or not.
Yeah.
But I remember once checking out a book about folk tales and comparing how they were. These happened to be European based, and there were like, well, in the French version,
Yeah.
there was this, and in the German version, there was this,
Mm-hmm.
in the North Italian version, there was this. Well, anyway, most of these were ungodly violent.
Yeah.
And a lot of it to me seemed quite sexist, and it was
Yeah.
teaching women how to behave.
Yeah.
And, you know, those folk tales reinforcing
Mhm.
the Bluebeard type of legend or, you know, something
Right.
like that. And, you know, certainly some of those things probably had a basis in fact.
Mhm.
But how does anthropology deal with that? Is that into the monsters version, or is that more into, you know, folk tales that teach by violence?
Okay, yeah, great question. And so when we're talking about these topics, I should say that it's interdisciplinary with psychology, with sociology, with history, for example. And so there's different ways of studying folklore, legends, tales, and so on. And so from an anthropological perspective, you know, you mentioned gender, for example. Yeah, we would absolutely look at
That way to me for this particular book.
yes, sex and gender, how those roles are reinforced by the particular values or mores of that society, how they're, you know, reinforced by the enculturation process of how one learns about their culture, how that is programmed. And enculturation starts from the time a baby is born. And so they're being taught how to act, what to believe, okay? So not just the family, the parents as enculturators, but the television, the folklore, the teacher, okay? They're all enculturators. And so the cultural, you know, beliefs can shift, they can evolve, but that is all put in through culture, okay, what is taught and learned. So yeah, so we would want to look at that, examine it, deconstruct it. What does it say about the society at the time? How did, you know, German folklore of a particular creature vary from the French version? Okay, what is maybe lost in translation? Okay, linguistically, that can be a problem, right? So you have all these different translations. We also see that with religion, okay? The interpretation is key. One sect interprets it in one way. The other sect interprets it in another way. So then you also have to look at the political aspects, right? Is there a political agenda, right, with the interpretation? So we would look at all of that. And that's the, you know, the interesting thing about anthropology is it is holistic. And if it sounds broad, it's because it is, okay? And that all falls under, you know, that discipline. Yeah. Is there a certain slide you'd like to go back to?
I would want to ask a question.
Yeah.
But there was the part about monster and where you were describing it coming from different languages.
Yeah.
And I got down to about the part that they carry complex meanings, symbolizing, and
Okay, yeah. Let me,
You know,
here?
It's interesting that most of the references you have were from the Latin or Greek, and that is actually an eccentric
Yeah.
perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an ethnocentric
Yes.
perspective.
It
in
is.
itself.
If the discipline. And so we would want to
We
look,
have nothing from Asia, we have nothing from Africa, we have nothing from South America.
well, we do have monsters in many different cultures all around the world. But when we, you know, I was zeroed in on our term monster.
Yeah.
But I do want to reiterate the point that these are found in all different cultures,
Yes.
you know. And so my class would be a survey, so we do touch upon some of the Asian monsters, but again, you can't cover everything. Yeah, no, and we have another colleague at UMSL that focuses on Asian monsters, for example. So she usually just does monsters in Japan and China, so for example. So there's so much there, but you're right that there is this Eurocentric aspect.
The word itself that
Yes,
we use
right.
comes from-
Yes, yes. What other questions do we have? We have a couple more minutes, and certainly I don't want to limit anyone's interaction. Yeah, but I thank all of you for coming. I really enjoyed talking with you, and if you want to hang around and ask a question at that point, feel more than welcome to do so. Thank you so much.